Hi, this is Mr. West, Ross's Most Stylish, and today I'm just going through a GCSE History B Cold War and USA paper. Now, a lot of you will have taken this paper home over half term, had a bit of a go at it, and are now looking for some answers to see if what you've done is right and any targets to improve it. Okay, now this first question deals with this source on Vietnamisation. Alright, now we can see down here from the mark scheme that there are two things that you're after. Okay, the main message supported by details of the cartoon or by contextual knowledge. So either things that are in the cartoon or knowledge that you know. And then to get up to the top level there, you've got to do both of those things. Alright, now what can be difficult sometimes is to work out the details of the source. What is not difficult if you have revised is to get the own knowledge in, okay? So if you know what Vietnamisation is, the idea of giving Vietnamisation, the idea of giving Vietnam back to the Vietnamese, allowing them to run their own country and continue the war if necessary, is what we're talking about here, okay? Clearly some own knowledge about that, as it says in the mark scheme. It could not surrender since in 1965 the American government had been persuading people at home that the war was just and vital. So it wanted to reduce the burden of the war on American people, but it didn't want it to look like a surrender. All right. So there's your Vietnamisation stuff. Then let's have a look at the cartoon. Now I don't actually agree with the mark scheme. Okay. It says Nixon is indecisive and being pulled in opposite directions. All right. But I actually think that perhaps, for my money, you could say that indecisive and clearly the mark scheme will give you credit. I'm not sure you can have no surrender and Vietnamisation at the same time. If it was being pulled along by some horses and they were both pulling in the same direction, then you could have both of those things. But I don't think you can have no surrender and Vietnamisation. For me, the British cartoonist is trying to say that if Nixon goes with Vietnamisation, he will have to let go of no surrender, and therefore he will have to actually surrender. Okay, that's what to me is saying. The mark scheme makes a nice point about the Vietnamisation being on his knees here, to suggest it's not working or something like that. Yeah, there's Nixon obviously in the middle. All right, so for me, the main message of the cartoon is that you can't have both. You can't have both Vietnamisation and no surrender. That's the main message. And then what I'm going to do to get top marks, I'm going to support that with, sorry, I've spelled it wrong, that's a spell check coming, with my knowledge about Vietnamisation and my knowledge and details from the cartoon. Okay, this next question for 8 marks deals with why the Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular in America. Okay, now like all of these types of explain questions, we're looking to try and explain more than one reason, 2 or 3 reasons. In this case, one reason well explained will get you 5 to 6 depending on how well explained it is, and more than one reason will get you 7 or 8. Okay, 8 marks for 3 explained more briefly, or 2 very developed answers. So that's what we're after. Now, the Vietnam War was the first televised war. People said the blood looked very red on the American television screens. Okay, in a situation where the horrors of war were being brought into people's living rooms for the first time. All right, and the napalm, the destruction can be seen very, very first-hand, okay? And to add to that, the American media portrayed it in a certain way. They weren't positive about it. They tried to look at the negatives. They tried to show the American soldiers as incompetent, okay? And always looked to try and put it in a negative light. Finally, we've got a good example of my lie, all right? 300 American civilians, as it says in the mark scheme here, were massacred, and that really hit home. Remember, it didn't come out straight away, but when it did, there was a massive public outcry. And finally, but arguably most importantly, the Americans were unsuccessful in Vietnam. The way of the guerrilla warfare meant that there was no front line, so it was hard for the Americans to see if any progress was being made, because as soon as you went through an area, the Viet Cong simply came back into it, all right? And when it was been unsuccessful, and with the deaths and the disfigurements of people coming back from Vietnam, meant that actually many people started to turn against the war that maybe wouldn't have done if it had been successful. So I've got 4 there. I might try and put them all in. They've all been explained pretty briefly, I reckon, but yeah, probably get 8 there because it's 4 explained briefly. But 2 or 3 things explained well. You can see some good examples here and here from the mark scheme, okay, that kind of brings a couple of them in together nicely. Yeah, okay, top marks. Okay, now we come on to the first of the option questions. Probably a good idea if you're having a go at this as exam practice to do every question, then you get a real feel for all the ones that are there. But if you've done this one, as I say, it's the ABC structure 4, 6, 10. Describe, explain, essay. That's always going to be the case, okay? So the first one then, the describe question, okay? What happened at the Potsdam Conference, all right? Now then, it's 4 marks, so up to 4 things. You could say really anything to do with it. You might pick something about the events, all right, that Stalin was informed that America had detonated the atomic bomb. Halfway through, Attlee was replaced by Churchill. Churchill was replaced by Attlee, let's get that right. Or you might come up with some of the disagreements that occurred there over what to do with Germany, what kind of state to leave Germany in, and also maybe to do with how much reparations Germany should pay, and also there's disagreement about Eastern Europe. The things that have changed as well would be that Stalin had taken over Eastern Europe. The Americans had obviously detonated the atomic bomb, as I've already mentioned, and those kind of things. So up to 4 marks, get it locked in, okay? B, explain why the USA and USSR alliance had broken down by 1947. Now, this is an alliance that obviously had fought from 1941 to 1945 together during the Second World War. All right. Now then, I've got a couple of examples here from the mark scheme. All right. Explain 1 reason. 4 to 5 marks, explains 2 reasons, 6 marks, okay? So first of all, Stalin was annoyed with the USA because Truman not told Stalin he was going to use the atomic bomb. Stalin was convinced that the USA would use the bomb to win worldwide power. So this idea here of Stalin being very worried about the atomic bomb and what power that posed, and the fact that the Americans had kept it secret really upset him. Yeah, and the next one, Stalin was about the atomic bomb. The USA would use the bomb to win worldwide power. The USA also refused to tell Stalin how to make the bomb, but Stalin decided scientists would develop a bomb. The USA felt threatened by this, so they refused to tell him what to do, and that was that. All right, but yeah, so that's the situation. Also, I think that there's a removal of a common enemy. All right, is an issue because the Americans and the USSR are in an alliance against Hitler, and that enemy keeps them together. Once that alliance or that enemy has been removed, then suddenly the differences come to the fore. Okay. Obviously, you could argue as well that Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe had meant that America couldn't trust him, and America had started then to, on their side of the Iron Curtain, to put in some money into it to try and build up their side. So there's several things there. Clearly, you want to try and explain 2 reasons to get the top marks. Okay, now then, the essay question. Which country had more successful policies in Europe between 45 and 49, the USA and the USSR? Obviously, explains USSR and USSR success or failure. So both sides of this, both sides of level 3, which would just be one side, is your 79 bracket. And then an evaluation of whom was more successful gets you 10 marks. That's a standard essay response for this. So let's have a look at what I've put down there. The USA, was successful. The Marshall Plan allowed Europe to recover without any Western countries turning communist. All right. So the Iron Curtain was there. America wouldn't have been happy about what had happened behind it, but no further countries were able to take over. Communism was contained. That was the aim of the Truman Doctrine, and communism was contained. Okay. Berlin was kept. All right. So when the Americans tried to starve the Berliners out by blockading Berlin, America was involved, as was Britain, in flying in the supplies once every 3 minutes or something like that, and kept it going for a year. And eventually Stalin had to give up and the USSR had to give up. But obviously the USA had lost land behind the Iron Curtain, and that land was never to be regained until the end of the Cold War. Okay, so and that's obviously a negative for them. Let's look across to the USSR. They took over large areas of Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland. You should be aware of how Stalin did that. Usually he would have a coalition government, and then he would have a rigged election or get some violence to intimidate the non-Russian elements, non-Soviet elements, and then he'd put his own party in power. However, he didn't get control of Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan was successful there, installing that, and he didn't manage to take Berlin in the Berlin blockade. It was unsuccessful. So therefore, just looking by the number of positives and negatives here, I would have to say that I'm going to evaluate that the USA's policies were more successful, because even though they lost part of Eastern Europe, they were in a position where they could get more successful stuff out of it, and I think towards the end of this period they were able to keep hold of Berlin, and that was a massive sucker punch to Stalin. Okay, this is the third question then, the one you can choose between 2 and 3. And I think this is a really good example of just looking where the marks lie, because actually the first question is quite difficult. How did Cuba change under Castro? For 4 marks, it's quite difficult. However, the other 2, I believe, are much more straightforward. So when I was looking at this, I'll probably be picking this question over the last one, because 16 of the 20 marks I feel I can get, and maybe get 2 or 3 out of 4. That is more difficult. So let's start with A. How did Cuba change under Castro? Well, what Castro did was he nationalised a lot of American investments in the area, so petrol stations, the kind of holiday industry, and a lot of kind of production in Cuba was just nationalised, simply taken off the Americans. All right, he got rid of elections, and it became like a one-party dictatorship, a one-party communist dictatorship in Cuba. He nationalised or collectivised farms as well in the communist style. But yeah, that's a difficult question for 4 marks. If you can get 3, you've done well. If you've got 4, you're absolutely doing brilliant. Remember though, it's just 4 marks, penny points, 4 relevant points, or maybe 3 relevant points with 1 explained, like the nationalisation one gets me 4 marks. Explain Kennedy's options after the missile sites were discovered in Cuba. Okay, again 6 marks, so you're looking, if you can, to explain 2 things. Explains 2 reasons, 6 marks there. Okay, yeah, Kennedy's options. Obviously, you can talk first of all about the blockade. That's what Kennedy did do. We know that was one of his options. He could enforce a blockade which would prevent further military supplies reaching Cuba. This would show the USA was serious, but it would not be an act of war and put the burden on Khrushchev to do what to do next. All right, so one of his options, put this quarantine around there. Okay, another option would be to attack Cuba, missiles. Try and destroy the missile bases before they got operation. Okay, but obviously that would be an act of war, and that would be a problem. It could have also launched an invasion. All right, sending the soldiers, but again, loss of life could have been high. And after the Bay of Pigs, perhaps he would have been not very tempted to go down that road. So there, I've just gone through 3 of the options that are there. I've explained them, all right, and I'll be looking to say to the examiner, let's have 6 out of 6 for that. Okay. Now in C, the USA was more responsible for causing the Cuban Missile Crisis than the USSR. How far do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer. Obviously, we can see the same mark scheme being applied here. Okay, although we can't actually see the. Let me just move it across. There we go. See the marks. So yeah, 7 to 9 marks is doing both sides, explaining why each country was responsible for the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then 10 marks for saying who was more responsible. Okay, so we should always be putting a conclusion in and trying to achieve that. Okay. Now then, where are we? Yeah. So the USA was responsible because it treated its treatment of Cuba during the Batista reign. Batista was like a puppet for the Americans, and Americans treated Cuba rather badly. Okay, during that time. And that kind of upset people, and it allowed Fidel Castro to get the support he wanted to come in and to take over from Batista. Then the Americans chose not to buy Cuban sugar, okay, which was a bit of a bad move, because what it did do was it opened the door to allow another country like Russia to come in, all right, and be involved with Cuba. They probably never thought that would happen, but my failure to buy Cuban sugar, yeah, that was that. Now then, also got the Bay of Pigs, which is where they used a series of expats, a series of Cuban people who lived there, who left when Castro came to power to try and invade on the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy was told by the CIA this would be successful. They got down there, got on the beach, and they were massively outgunned. It was a complete and utter disaster. But again, all right, it alienated Cuba from America and pushed them further, perhaps, towards Khrushchev and towards maybe accepting missiles, because they were directly under threat from American action. So what I've tried to do there is, for the USA section, is I've tried to say how they put Cuba in a position where maybe they look to Khrushchev and the USSR, and maybe they look to get some missiles in for their own security. So that's why mainly I believe America was responsible. What about USSR? Well, Khrushchev really wanted to make Kennedy look weak. All right, the Berlin Wall had gone up in the previous year, and Khrushchev, as I say, wanted to make Kennedy look weak. So he kind of adopted this attack on, or placing these things onto Cuba, these missiles, to try and make Kennedy look weak. All right. Then the USSR allied with Cuba. Okay, they bought their sugar, and they kind of brought Cuba into the Russian fold, and then finally they placed missiles on Cuba. All right. Now, the simple answer to this question, I think, is the USSR was more responsible because they put the missiles on Cuba. However, I think that's perhaps you should be thinking as well that actually what did America do to make Cuba feel that they could look abroad and then accept these kinds of missiles from the Russians? So my guts would say, first of all, in the short term, obviously Russia is responsible, but in the longer term, that maybe America was responsible for creating the situation where this could have happened.